You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. 26 years ago this week, more than 40,000 people came to Seattle to protest the World Trade Organization at the WTO's ministerial conference.
It doesn't matter what your issue is, you are going to get worked over if these people are allowed to continue with their unregulated, rampant lust for profit.
How long are you going to stay out here today?
I will stay out here until they take me away.
A diverse group of labor organizers, farmers, and environmental groups planned and executed peaceful action against what many saw as anti-democratic elements of the WTO and the profound risks from unfettered expansion of global trade. At events from Memorial Stadium to the waterfront and marches in downtown Seattle, advocates from the Global South joined arms with American steelworkers decrying the outsourcing of jobs. Ultimately, protesters were successful in shutting down much of the WTO's planned talks, mostly by literally blocking streets. And the Battle of Seattle pushed the issue of trade policy to the front page in the late 90s. But for many, the enduring memories from that week in Seattle are the clouds of tear gas deployed by police and broken windows at downtown businesses. A new documentary called WTO/99 tries to capture the events on the ground as they happen. It is composed entirely of archival footage without narration, and it highlights the way narratives around power and protest are shaped by media images. That's a relevant issue for today, and I want to talk about that with Ian Bell, a director who is based here in Seattle, and he is the director of WTO 99. Ian, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So how long had you been considering making a film about the WTO protests, and why now?
I think the first time I mentioned it to Alex Megaro, my editing partner, was maybe 5 years ago. We've been editing together for about 6 or 7 years. We've been producing together for much longer. And we had a show at Vice News for a while called Source Material, also in the same vein, all archival, kind of examining events through the lens of the people that were there. I think I mentioned to him just in passing that maybe around the 2016 election, that we might be able to learn a little bit about what's happening politically if we ever had a chance to examine the events of WTO in Seattle in '99. And it also was like, I was always really curious about it because I was born and raised here. My family's been here for generations, but I happened to not be there that week. I had moved to Japan a few months before, and it stuck in the back of my mind that the world had come to my town and had this major debate. And when we came across the archive that was being put together, it felt like a no-brainer to dive in.
So where did you get this archive? There's so much footage from protesters, from looks like the police at least were filming some for themselves, and there is obviously a lot from Cairo 7. Where were you sourcing?
So the project started after I moved back from New York, I was trying to get a sense for the different archives that were in town and who were the archivists. And over the course of a few coffees, I learned that an organization called MEPOPs here in Seattle was working with an organization that was active at the time at WTO called the Independent Media Center, or people from the Independent Media Center were collecting all the tapes that independent producers and videographers had created at the time from the streets. And they estimated they had about 400 hours, a lot of which had yet to be seen. And so the MEPOPs was digitizing it with the goal of housing it at the special collections at the University of Washington. And so we met the archivists and we just asked them if once they're done, we could take a look. And so about 6 months later, maybe a year later, they were finished with the project and we started working.
And how did you decide what to feature? I mean, how do you take hundreds of hours of film and present a narrative, that fairly captures what happened on the ground? I mean, it's a really big undertaking. How did you approach that?
Yeah, so real quickly, in addition to the 400 hours, we found an additional 6 along the way. So we've had about 1,000 hours of footage. And the way we work is we watch every second of every tape that we get access to, and we identify time and place. And as we're doing that, we're starting to construct real-time scenes throughout the week. Eventually, we had, I don't know, roughly a 6 or 8 hour cut that spanned over the 4 days featured in the film, along with the day that protests began, but the ministerial hadn't begun. And so we ended up not showcasing that first day, the 29th of November.
And just so people know, the film ultimately is about an hour 40. So you really
Yeah.
you had to keep editing. Yeah, there was a lot of hit the cutting room floor.
Yeah, so we kind of consider it like making a block of clay. Like we have to make the clay first, and then we can carve the sculpture. And the way we do it is we build out the scene and the days in real time. We're looking for people showing their watches. We're looking for clocks like the old Ben Bridges clocks that were downtown. We're looking for people who accurately burnt in time code so that we can see someone had time code, but it was on Mountain Standard, so we always had to be adjusting for it. Oftentimes we had 2 to 10 cameras in the same location. So we would be able to sync up multicam scenes based on a traffic cone being flown up in the air or the same sign being waved. And so
that was incredible to me. I just want to pop in and describe this to people. You had moments where, say, there was a protester with a handheld camera that was looking at a police line, and then you could switch over, and on the police line, there was somebody holding a camera, or somewhere there was something filming. So you could have the two sides looking at each other in the course of, the way you laid out the cuts. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and there's another moment where it's the first time that we have on film the Seattle Police Department using pepper spray on the crowd. It's right by the old Nike town. And we have multiple angles from the crowd, but then we're able to cut behind the police line and see what it looks like from an officer's point of view spraying the crowd. And so it's that because there's such a robust archive, we're able to create these multicam scenes it was in real time. We of course trim it down for the viewing experience, but so that you can kind of get a sense of what it was like to be there.
This was before body cameras, though? I mean, who is filming on the police side?
Yeah, they're just holding like little mini DV cams.
Could you tell why they were doing that? Was there a reason that you could discern that they would be filming in that way?
I can only speculate that it might be for training, it might be for evidence to see if they can use it for any cases in the future, for any potential lawsuits.
Did you think about sitting down with folks? It sounds like you started out, your medium is these archival types of projects. Did you ever think about sitting down with folks to do interviews for this project, or was it always going to be the archival mode?
Yeah, for me, it's the archives are the most important or the most interesting. But I know enough folks that were there, and they have friends that were there, and probably every month or so, I'd have a casual lunch or coffee with someone and hear their stories. And it definitely helped me understand the emotion and the energy, especially or what was being seen off frame. There are times where we only have 1 or 2 angles. And so hearing those stories helped me understand maybe the larger world at times. There was one in particular, a few people mentioned in our lunch meetups, but the sound of the nightsticks slapping against the shin guards. And how haunting that was. And those images in the film and in the archive are so stark. It's such a otherworldly scene to see municipal officers form and approach citizens that way. But to hear their stories and to hear them remembering them, I think informed the way we approach those moments.
We're going to take a short break here. I'm Libby Dankman. You're listening to Soundside. We're going to have more in just a minute from director Ian Bell and his new documentary, WTO 99. Back in a moment on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. I'm talking with director Ian Bell about his new documentary, WTO 99. It's made completely from archival footage of what became known as the Battle in Seattle. Groups of labor organizers, environmental activists, farmers, child labor activists, all kinds of people descending on Seattle to protest the WTO and the expansion of free trade across the world and what they saw as anti-democratic elements of that. So day one, the ministers and the folks who are showing up for the meeting, they're expecting to have an opening ceremonies at the Paramount. Protesters have other plans. Give us a little TikTok of how things unfold that day, and then what you saw in the footage as we start to see, streets are shut down, the opening ceremonies is delayed, and then it appears that the word goes out to police that they need to get more aggressive. They need to start clearing these streets. Can you give us kind of a little TikTok of what we saw in the footage?
Yeah, from what we saw and what you see in the film, the direct action that's taking place in the streets is clearly effective at clogging the intersections, and in their attempt to make it so ministers and other participants in the ministerial can't reach their meetings. From there, and there was a lot of claims made about what protesters were and weren't doing. None of the justifications that were said at the time are visible in the archive.
Like
And
Molotov cocktails, that was something that came up in the Gibson book, for example, that even to this day, there's some people from the law enforcement perspective who are like, we had Molotov cocktails thrown and that's what instigated. You didn't see any of that in the archival.
No, and it's really clear in the visual archive that there's none of that took place. The police department wanted to clear the intersection, and they did so with force and chemical weapons. And so what we see in the film and in the broader archive is the police become more aggressive and clear the intersection so that ministers can walk freely into the meetings.
And more aggressive means tear gas, pepper spray, initially starting with pepper spray.
Mm-hmm.
And then we start to see the rubber bullets, what are sometimes called less lethal rounds. And then when does the tear gas start?
The tear gas started just after 11 a.m. And we timed that against both. I think we had something like a dozen angles on that scene, but also we had access to the archived SPD radio channels, the audio recordings, and that announces the time every few minutes.
And that is pretty soon after the opening ceremony is delayed. And the impression is, that you have the mayor, you have Madeleine Albright, you have the governor, you have, the president's on his way, going to be in Seattle, that evening, the following day. There is a ramping up of expectations that these streets get cleared. And that seems to be, what happens, that police who are initially holding lines and watching the protests take over downtown blocks, they go in and they're told to clear those streets.
Yeah. Yeah. And they talk about violence, they talk about broken windows, but there was no sign of violence from the protesters, and the broken windows came later. And again, that's from a small group of people that did that action.
So the broken windows, which did happen, those are happening later in the day on day one. And what you saw was that occurred after there were, again, the clearances by police, the tear gas, things like that.
Yeah.
There is one protester at a certain point who says on either local news or some other source, if I see that video of half a dozen or so people busting into Starbucks again, I'm going to scream. And I think that gets us into the idea of the images that were being disseminated on local news, international news, versus what was actually happening on the street. What did you make of that issue of the media narrative versus reality?
Yeah, it's difficult. I watched every hour of local news I could find from that week. We watched plenty of national and international news as well. And The one source that we ended up relying on to have a clearer narrative about what was happening on the streets was the CBC. If you on day one, there's a number of clips from their broadcasts, and they seemed to be they were the only news outlet we could find that attributed the violence to the police officers, that attributed the escalation to the police officers, and that had a nuanced understanding of the very broad coalition of people that had gone to the streets and the reasons why. It was local news they seemed to have a lot of difficulty around the broader topics and the diversity of the coalition. And I think most people, when they hear the word violence, they think of harm against another body. But that word has other definitions. And whether it's the state or local media, that word also seems to mean harm against property. And so even though that might be their authentic way of understanding what violence is, I think most people at home, when they hear violent protesters, they think that they're wielding bats and throwing Molotov cocktails, which is not the case. But that's the impression a lot of people were left with. I don't know where the media standpoint comes from, but one thing that I found really interesting listening to the police broadcast, the radios they were talking to each other with, there's a lot of moments when they're spreading misinformation amongst each other. And you can kind of hear that there's a fear that's being ginned up.
Between law
People with
enforcement?
baseball bat. Yeah, like there'd be reports on the radio. People, there's someone with a baseball bat or a piece of wood with a nail sticking out. Or there's all these people have chains. Be wary. And so they're reporting.
And you looked again at hundreds, 1,000 hours of archival footage. Did you see weapons amongst the protesters? And were you looking for that?
Oh yeah, yeah. And we found nothing. And then local news plays into that fear by reporting, mass chaos, mass violence. And really it's a few broken windows and a number of intersections that are jammed up.
Did you get the feeling that not just local news, but local authorities, the mayor, Paul Schell looks shocked and like he is a little bit in disbelief when he's, especially on day one and day two, addressing the media. Did you get the sense that Seattle was overwhelmed by almost 50,000 people showing up and this really concerted, planned set of protests that shut down the streets and purposefully engaged in these protest actions? Did it feel like the city didn't know how to respond, either its media or its elected officials?
Yeah, it seems really clear that they were ill prepared. And, these intersections are being cleared so people can attend meetings. I would imagine that given the right preparation, they could have established corridors or any other tactics. And I'm not even sure they have a case to be caught off guard, because from reading some of the books that have been written about the events, it seemed like there was enough knowledge and enough coordination with law enforcement, with local government, and the activist groups that were planning on coming, that they could have had a pretty clear picture of what might take place.
I want to talk about one moment that you captured or that you highlighted from the archives. That has to do with a police officer who holds a protester down with their knee on his neck. He's a white protester. We're going to play just a little bit of that archival audio here. The image is very stark, very disturbing. You hear the protester pleading with police to get the knee off his neck.
You're really hurting me, and I'm not struggling at all. I am not struggling at all. I am not struggling. I am peaceful. Remove your knee from my neck.
So again, the protester doesn't appear to be posing any threat at the time of this arrest. The police officer does remove his knee eventually on the tape from the protester's neck. Can you describe that moment? What you were thinking when you included that in the documentary?
We started the project not just because I wasn't here and I didn't understand the events, but we started this project at a time where politics was shifting. That it was clear that the labor class had left the Democratic Party in mass, and we thought that the WTO would be a way to understand uh, our current day.
As in, Trump was able to get a lot of labor support. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
At least
yeah,
membership of labor unions. Yeah.
that's right. I mean, the deindustrialization had taken place, and we ended up finding other parallels and other ways to understand our contemporary through the film. One was the police action and police militarization. So you can see that there are other things that are emerging here, which is, kettling, which is very common now, is being auditioned here in Seattle, and we see it really clearly in the first major gassing scene on 6th and Union. And on day two, as the protesters were gathering, they were actually already gathered when the mayor said that it was illegal to assemble. And to see the police or a police officer have the knee on someone's neck, to have that tactic being used 25 years ago, it was a real clear mirror to our current day.
You're, of course, going to be accused of selectively choosing this archival footage. With the protester with the knee on the neck, there will be people who watch this and say, well, you didn't show what happened before. What is your response when somebody looks at this and says, well, we think it's from a protester perspective, and maybe there's bias being shown in what's being chosen?
Yeah, that's the archive is public. People can find access to it at the University of Washington. And it's I think it's really important to attempt some objectivity. I do believe that there is a observable universe that we can be objective about. And one of the ways that we approach that is by establishing rules that can hedge against your own bias and editorialization. And there's a reason why we stick to the chronology so strictly. There's a reason why we seek out every tape we can get access to. There's a reason why we don't use narration. We don't want to guide the audience with an additional layer of editorialization. There's a reason why we try to construct text cards that are free of editorialization, that are as dry as possible. There's a reason why we attempt to have as subtle as music as possible. It glues the footage together at times, but we're hoping not to be too directive about our approach to music.
Or I guess when we think about music, sometimes we say we don't want to manipulate people's feelings with the music, right? It's just to provide some momentum, provide some connection. Yeah.
And I find that's actually the trickiest part for me, as I try to create a framework to be as removed as possible, just to be kind of like the tool for the footage to emerge, to say what it wants. I went to graduate school in the environmental social sciences, and not any scientists that are listening, not in an actual robust way, but we do lean on the ideas of thematic analysis. As we're watching the footage, we identify themes that are being spoken about in the streets, both from the police POV and the municipal powers and the people on the ground. And we're taking notes so that when we cut it down, we make sure not to remove a theme. Even if it's minor, it'll show up for a moment. Or at least that's our hope. And if it's major, we'll make sure that it shows up kind of proportional to the weight in the archive. And so we are trying to construct a framework that removes our feelings as much as possible. And in fact, we approach these stories like we did in source material and here with WTO 99 out of curiosity, because we know we don't know enough. And so, and I think that it comes across, and I hope that it comes across, that that's the reason why we've made these choices.
Ultimately, again, the WTO protest succeeded in disrupting much of the agenda of this ministerial meeting. You still had the president come and speak, President Clinton come and speak in support of free trade. He talks a little bit about people's right to speak up and free speech, but he also talks about people who were troublemakers and breaking windows. And I think that you make the case that trade and workers' rights and environmentalism and everything that was problematic about this era of the WTO's establishment and its expansion, that was getting into the national consciousness. At the same time, again, many people saw what happened in Seattle as chaotic. There were the images of the property damage that endured. And I think especially in Seattleites' minds, that started this cleaving of narratives between people who saw like Seattle as being a city where anarchy and anarchists are supported and celebrated, versus people who saw this as a city where we welcomed and participated in really important free speech events. What do you think today about the memory of these WTO protests?
I don't know. I don't know if there is a clear memory of the protests. It seems to me, especially as we travel with the film, that there isn't a memory, a collective memory of these events. And it's been really exciting to play it for folks in different towns and hear from people who were there, whether we're in the South or the Northeast, or we just got back from Europe. There's always someone that was there. And they have really vivid memories, but we as a people don't remember what the protesters were protesting, what they were trying to get accomplished. That is not to say they weren't effective. I think that the reason why we remember broken windows is because that's all that was reported on. And at the end of day one in the film, state senator from California, Tom Hayden, gets stopped by the local media, and they ask him his impressions of the events. And he talks about a document that Hugh had access to once he entered government. This was, I think, in the 70s. But the goal was for the powers that be to convince people that protest is not effective. And when people walk away from these events, or they, even family members, of mine and other folks I knew, they left those events, or they left their media experience of those events believing that it was just anarchy and chaos and broken windows. They are left discouraged about what public expression can be. And when we are convinced that protest doesn't work, then we are less likely to do it and less likely to make change through those means.
Tom Hayden, of course, one of the Chicago Seven who was prosecuted in the wake of the DNC in 1968. That just kind of leaves me with this final thought. You end the film mentioning that there had been this momentum from 1999 until 2001, all sorts of protests at events for these international bodies that are controlling the money and the flow of goods and the way that jobs, are leaving, and labor standards are being lowered, environmental standards are being lowered across the country as free trade is proliferating. But then 9/11, and that, your thesis is, moves the issue of trade off of the front page. And there's this great juxtaposition. One is a protester who's speaking at a Seattle City Council meeting about, yes, it's Christmas, but Jesus Christ was a peaceful demonstrator against an imperialist regime, and I don't remember him caring about shopping very much. Trying to make the case for keeping your eye on what was important about the protests. And then you have, just a few years later, George W. Bush, speaking from the White House, basically saying, don't let the terrorists win. Make sure you go out and shop. I don't know if that was an intentional juxtaposition or, kind of the message that you were hoping to leave people with at the end. Can you explore that with us?
Well, the end, the reason why we crafted the end the way it was listening to the interviews of the day, reading the books from the time, And the archive for us didn't stop on the last day of the WTO protest. We then examined reports, and watched as much footage as we could throughout the city council hearings. We actually watched every hour of it. And we were trying to find where the energy dissipated. And everything we came across identified the events of 9/11 as a moment of that interrupted that energy. It is interesting through the film, going back to local news, they often comment on how the streets should be filled with shoppers. And I think there's at least one or two moments in the film, but it was throughout the archive.
Because this is right after Thanksgiving. It's the beginning of December. Downtown, you see the string lights and the decorations everywhere. You're right by Nordstrom. And at the time, the Bon Marché. You're expecting there to be, if everything's right with the world, according to that perspective, people with shopping bags. Yeah.
And it just it's confounding that was the approach that local media took on such a massive event of expression and people trying to alter the course of the global economic order.
Actions, protests in Los Angeles, Seattle, all over the country around No Kings. And not in this last No Kings protest, but in the first No Kings earlier in the year, you had 40,000 people in the street peacefully protesting. And later in the evening, you had people near the ICE facility at the federal building in downtown, a couple dozen people who, lit some things on fire and blockaded the exit to the ICE facility. And those images are elevated and promoted to the same degree or even more so than the 40,000 people in the streets peacefully. I don't know that it makes a difference, or maybe we just haven't learned any lessons from 1999. What do you think about that?
One of the things I found really magical about reviewing all the footage is to see people with such divergent points of view and coming from such different backgrounds, finding common cause. I think that's been made harder, but there was a moment when, estimates of 40 to 75,000 people could get together and agree on one thing and effectively stop it for a moment. And as we show the film, and especially younger folks that don't have any exposure to this history, have commented on how inspiring it is that there was a time when people were able to set aside their differences and take on what they saw as a common threat.
Ian Bell is the director of WTO 99. That's WTO/99, a new documentary about the WTO protests in 1999. And we'll also share how people can see the documentary at the Northwest Film Forum in our show notes. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to Soundside today on this Giving Tuesday. And I want to make a note that KUOW is working towards this goal today of raising $50,000 for local news and programming, just like Soundside. We're one of those programs. There's $13,000 remaining in the goal today for Giving Tuesday. It makes a big difference when you give during a local show like what we're doing here today, Soundside, what all the producers and everybody are working towards, myself. So KUOW.org is the way to give, and I really appreciate everybody who thinks of us on this Giving Tuesday. Thank you.